Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the public debate today, which is this House believes the government-imposed culture of fear damages the economy. We have for you today some wonderful speakers. On proposition, we've got Professor Somnath Sen and Mr. John Smeller, MP. And opposing them, we have Dr. Martin Jensen and Dr. Andrew Lillico. It's hopefully going to be a wonderful debate for everybody. But before we kick off events, let's just take a quick vote so we can see who's coming in on proposition, opposition or abstention. At the end, after they've made their speeches, we'll ask you to vote again, and we can then determine who's won the debate going by the swing of votes. So can I take votes in proposition, please? And votes in abstention? Wonderful. So all of the speakers today will have 7 minutes to make their case and to try and persuade you, try and win over that enormous abstention constituency that you seem to have in the room. There will be various noises during their speeches. At 1 minute, there'll be a noise like this, which indicates that the other side can offer points of information if they would like to. The speakers are by no means obliged to take those points of information. They may choose to decline them in various ways. At 6 minutes, there'll be a noise again like that, declaring that you can no longer offer those points of information and just to sort of politely listen. And at 7 minutes, there'll be that noise twice, asking those speakers to then kind of wrap up their speeches. After all the speakers have had their turn, we'll turn to you, so start thinking of some things that you want to say. You guys will have like sort of 3 minutes to say whatever it is you want to say on the debate, either in proposition, opposition or abstention, and there'll be the opportunity to win these lovely bottles of wine which are now sat tantalisingly close to me. So, yeah, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker from the proposition, Professor Somnath Sen. I don't think that will come on, but the acoustics are quite good in here. Okay, magic.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members of the opposition, I would like to propose to this Assembly that the House believes that government-imposed culture of fear damages the economy. And what I would like to do is try to explain relatively quickly what we mean in the sense that this particular proposition has been placed. We know that all economies, particularly mature economies, Britain, France, United States, runs on expectation, on confidence, on optimism. In addition to the core fundamental features such as investment growth policy, but expectations are absolutely fundamental in any modern economy. And effectively, this government, as the proposition says, is hiding behind the fig leaf of fear. It's a sort of idea that beware, the economy is in trouble and therefore we need austerity. Beware, the economy is ill and therefore we need some horrible medicine. This idea that there's something intrinsically wrong in terms of our expectations, in terms of our anticipations, in terms of our optimism, is what we would call a culture of fear. And we want to show why it damages the economy. So instead of tackling the major areas of the British economy where there are issues and there are problems, there seems to be a refuge under the protection of sometimes very bad economics and often, as we say, a culture of fear. So we want to show that in major areas of the British economy where this bogey person is there somewhere, that the Red Riding Hood of the British economy is going to be taken out by this big bad wolf, and the wolf is the debt-GDP ratio. Something dangerous is going to happen. The Eurozone export competitiveness, the end of our export industries, youth unemployment, creation of human capital, creation of physical infrastructure, that there is something there which almost showing that government policy is being replaced by government psychosis. But the idea that these things can be changed, and we know from good economics that it has been changed and will be changed, that idea is not coming through. So we are not claiming, please understand, that we are not claiming that all is well. We are claiming that there are fundamental problems in the British economy. We know that there are fundamental problems in the world economy. We know that we have gone through what is now being called the Great Contraction, that maybe after the Great Depression, it is the greatest downswing in the last 70, 80, or 100 years. We know that. What we are saying is that given these problems, we need policies. We don't need discussion of the culture of fear, because that's going to damage the economy, and the economy is not going to do as well as it could have if it did not have this psychosis around it. So there are good political reasons for doing it. We understand why politicians would be behaving in that way. It's easy to raise bogey persons and get votes, but what we are concerned with is the issue of the culture of fear. So I'm going to give examples, and just a few brief things at the beginning. We know that economic behavior depends on fundamentals. As I said, it depends on growth, capital accumulation, human capital, education, R&D, in areas in which we often lead the world and have led the world for centuries. And therefore, we know that these are important, and we're not saying that there's nothing wrong or nothing, everything is fine, etc. But we know that the economy depends on expectation. And we know that expectations depend upon what economists call full information expectation, rational expectation, the ability to take every factor into account and form expectation. It also depends on our past experience. It depends on the fact that we can adapt, we can learn. It depends on adaptation, adaptive expectations, macroeconomists call it. And we also know that our expectations depend on what signals we send each other, how much we learn from each other. My distinguished game theorist friend would call it cheap talk, but we know that governments give out a huge amount of information. The speeches, the media, political scientists calls it norm-changing behavior. We change our norms depending on what we hear and understand. And all these things, there has been a tendency over the last few years, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever, the coalition government is very adept at doing it, very good public relations at doing it. We have seen that again and again this idea is that these communications have become more strident, more problematic and difficult. So take any aspect of the British economy or take any theoretical model, you can see that if expectations are wrong, then that particular thing sinks, something goes wrong. So let me just mention one brief thing, and that I found quite interesting while I was thinking of this topic, and that is that when it comes to social issues, the government is not really imposing a culture of fear. You know, when inner city riots take place, or took place, it is the fault of gangs. When NHS waiting lists are rising a huge amount, it's the fault of management. When civil servants' pensions are being destroyed and they go on strike, the fault of unions. There's a blame culture. There's a blame culture when it comes to social problems. It's not fear, it's a blame. And the government says, we're blaming somebody somewhere, but we'll do it, we'll change it, we'll improve waiting lists, we will cut down on crime and social deprivation, etc. But when it comes to economic problems, you see a subtle change in emphasis. That idea, of course we're going to blame euro, growth rate in China and what happened in the United States and so on and so forth. But in addition, we are going to say that you must be afraid of it. So let me give you a few examples. We've got a number of examples. I've got quite a few examples, but time is short. So just give you an example of how some form of misinformation, exaggeration, discredited economics, all are creating a climate of fear which tends to reduce our growth and reduce our well-being. Let's take one. Is that two?
Yeah.
So I've got 1 minute left?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take 1.5. Okay, so let's take the biggest one. Then okay, I've got 7 examples. This is, we are trained to teach for 50 minutes. So, but this is not. So let me just get the core example. The one that absolutely strikes fear in the heart of people when politicians talk. The size of the debt. The size of the debt-GDP ratio. That. Look at Greece. Look at the bond market. The bond market is another of these things that you think of a sort of monster outside in a dark evening, and the bond market is there. And look at the bond market and what the bond markets will do. And so there's nothing systemic and nothing fundamental of having a high debt after the financial crisis. The financial crisis is like a war. Every time in the last 200, 300 years, you look at public debt to GDP ratio, every single country fought a war, it went up and then it came down. Since 1950, the net public debt as a share of GDP has consistently fallen. Conservative, Labour, conservative, I don't care, it has fallen. And this fall in the net public GDP is now, half a minute. Yeah. And so the point that we're trying to make, therefore, is basically that there's nothing systemic, nothing fundamental. Essentially, the debt-GDP ratio in this country is 80%. In Germany, it's more. In France, it's more. It was 40% 10 years ago in the heyday of Gordon Brown. It's rose after 2007. And so this fear that the debt-GDP ratio will swallow up this economy and we can't do anything, that's obviously wrong, and that cannot be sustained by any form of 10-year data. And all historical data shows that. So basically, therefore, to sum up, I would say that many of the economic issues that have been said up to now are essentially not about fundamental, but just making us afraid. Thank you.
Hello. Hello everyone, and thank you. Honorable audience, that's what I was supposed to say. Let me begin by speaking a little bit about what Somnath said here. So essentially the story is telling you, right, is that things are very bad, the economy runs on expectation. It's very important how I feel when I wake up in the morning. If I feel bad, if the government is making me feel bad, I'm not going to spend as much money. Now, there is some truth to that theoretically, but in this particular case, I'm not so sure that what is the alternative. It is what? It's to lie to people, to not actually tell people what's going on is the best idea. And why is that? Well, for a couple of reasons, really. I mean, first of all, right, just imagine. I mean, imagine that the government, the president or the previous government, all the time went out and said to us, things are going great. I mean, it's just wonderful. I mean, nothing to worry about at all. No concerns at all. That's a joke. I mean, people are not that stupid. And more importantly, maybe for the crisis we're in right now, markets are not that stupid. So you can lie to people all that you want, but I seriously doubt that anyone's going to believe it, given what is going on. Because what is going on right now is that if we look out the window, we read the newspapers, and we see every second day another nation blows up, right? It's like standing in Baghdad during Operation Desert Storm. And so in that kind of a climate, it's very, very difficult to really bias people's expectations downward. The best thing you can probably do is to tell them the truth. Now that's one thing that's quite important, and I think there's another one which I think I want to do 1 minute on computing, but there's another one I want to say, I want to get to here, which is this. With any kind of austerity plan, as what we're seeing right now, with cuts in public spending and so on and so forth, one thing that's hugely important is that people understand why this is done. If you don't explain these kind of things to people, Jesus, I mean, there'll be riots. There'll be riots in the streets, right? You have absolutely got to explain to people why you're cutting to the extent you are at the moment. Now, what is being suggested here is that we shouldn't. We should just what? Cut, solve the fundamental difficulties, as it's being said, and then what? At the same time say, and you know what? There's not really any good reason for it. There's nothing's really wrong, okay? What the hell do you think would happen then? So I really don't think that would fly. I think what needs to be done at this point is tell people the truth. And the truth, the big bad wolf, the debt to GDP ratio, that is a big problem. That is not something we can simply sort of